On a cold December morning in 1776, while the world still slept under the weight of kings and empires, a nearly forgotten army stood shivering on the banks of a black, ice-choked river. Their boots were torn, their coats thin, their stomachs empty. Some of them had wrapped rags around bleeding feet. Others whispered prayers they had never learned properly. Many believed they would be dead by sunrise. And yet, history was about to bend. Because that night, against reason, against fear, against impossible odds, a fragile idea called America refused to die. This is not a myth. This is not patriotic fantasy. This is the true, human, painful, and astonishing story of how the United States of America was born, not through certainty, but through doubt, not through power, but through desperation, not through heroes carved from marble, but through ordinary people who chose to stand when running would have been easier. This is the story of the United States as it truly was, fractured, fearful, hopeful, and unfinished. Part 1. A continent before a country. Long before there was a United States, there was a continent that did not know its own future. In the early 1600s, North America was not new at all. It was ancient. Forests older than European memory stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. Rivers carried stories that had been whispered for thousands of years. Indigenous nations, Haudenosaunee, Cherokee, Powhatan, Lakota, Apache, and hundreds more, governed land through tradition, diplomacy, and war. They traded, fought, loved, and mourned long before any European flag touched their soil. When the first English settlers arrived at Jamestown in 1607, they did not step into an empty wilderness. They stepped into a world that already had rules, and they did not understand them. Most of those early settlers were not dreamers of freedom. They were investors, laborers, and survivors. Jamestown nearly collapsed within its first year. Hunger consumed men faster than disease. Some resorted to cannibalism. The dream of a profitable colony almost died before it began. Further north, in 1620, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, not seeking wealth, but religious survival. They carried Bibles and fear in equal measure. Their first winter killed half of them. Without help from the Wampanoag people, especially a man named Squanto, the colony would have vanished. The early American story was not heroic. It was fragile. Colonies of unequal dreams. As decades passed, 13 British colonies slowly took shape along the Atlantic coast, but they were never unified in spirit or purpose. Virginia grew rich on tobacco, dependent on enslaved African labor. Massachusetts became rigidly religious, intolerant in the name of faith. Pennsylvania experimented with tolerance under Quaker ideals. South Carolina built wealth on rice plantations and brutal slavery. New York balanced commerce, diversity, and ambition. Each colony had its own laws, fears, and identities. People did not think of themselves as Americans. They were Virginians, New Yorkers, Pennsylvanians, loyal subjects of the British Crown. And Britain ruled them loosely at first. For over a century, the colonies enjoyed what historians later called salutary neglect. London was far away. As long as money flowed and peace held, the empire largely looked elsewhere. But empires do not stay distracted forever. The war that changed everything. In 1754, a spark ignited in the forests of North America, the French and Indian War. Britain and France fought for control of the continent. Indigenous nations were forced to choose sides or be crushed between empires. The war lasted nearly a decade and ended in British victory. Britain won the land, but it lost something far more important. The war had drained the British treasury.
London looked west, not to reward the colonies, but to make them pay. New taxes followed: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. For the first time, Parliament taxed the colonies directly. The colonists asked a dangerous question: why should we pay taxes to a government in which we have no voice? The phrase spread like wildfire: no taxation without representation. At first, resistance was cautious: protests, boycotts, petitions. Colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects, but loyalty has limits. Boston, where anger took shape. Boston became the center of resistance. British soldiers marched its streets. Tension thickened the air. In 1770, fear exploded into violence. 5 colonists were killed by British troops in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's engraving spread across the colonies, depicting British soldiers firing mercilessly into a crowd. The image was propaganda, but powerful. Truth mattered less than feeling. 3 years later, in 1773, colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped 342 chests of British tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party was not random chaos, it was deliberate defiance. Britain responded harshly, closing Boston's port, dissolving colonial assemblies, and sending more troops. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, Britain united the colonies against itself. The unthinkable becomes inevitable. In 1774, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They did not declare independence, they still hoped reconciliation was possible. But war was already approaching. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial weapons. They were met by armed farmers at Lexington. A shot was fired. No one knows by whom. But the world changed forever. The American Revolutionary War had begun. An accidental leader. When fighting broke out, the colonies needed leadership. They turned to a tall, quiet Virginian named George Washington. Washington was not a revolutionary radical. He was a plantation owner, a former British officer, a man deeply aware of his own flaws. But he possessed something rare: discipline without arrogance, authority without cruelty, and a willingness to endure humiliation without surrender. In June 1775, the Second Continental Congress appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. It was an army in name only, poorly trained, poorly armed, barely paid. Washington knew the truth: if Britain crushed them quickly, the idea of independence would vanish like smoke. All he had to do, at first, was survive.
By the summer of 1775, the idea of rebellion had escaped the control of reason. What had begun as protests and petitions had turned into open warfare, but no one, not even the loudest patriots, truly believed the colonies could win. The British Empire was the most powerful force on earth. Its navy ruled the oceans. Its army was disciplined, professional, and battle-hardened. The Americans had farmers and hope. An army held together by belief. George Washington arrived outside Boston to take command of the Continental Army and immediately saw the truth that terrified him. Men came and went as they pleased. Weapons were mismatched. Gunpowder was scarce. Disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Some men had enlisted for only a few months. Others expected to go home for harvest season. Many had never fired a musket in battle. Washington understood something critical. If this war was fought like a traditional war, America would lose. So he fought it like a war of survival. He drilled his men relentlessly. He enforced discipline where chaos reigned. He punished desertion, not out of cruelty,
but necessity. He slept among his soldiers. He shared their hunger. He wrote letters late into the night, begging Congress for supplies that rarely came. Congress, for its part, was divided, cautious, and broke. The American Revolution was not powered by efficiency. It was powered by stubborn endurance. The words that made a nation possible. In January 1776, as cannons echoed and blood soaked the soil, a small pamphlet spread through the colonies. Its title was simple, Common Sense. Its author, Thomas Paine, an English immigrant with no political power and nothing to lose. Paine did what speeches and resolutions could not. He spoke directly to ordinary people. He attacked monarchy as absurd. He questioned why a distant island should rule a vast continent. He argued that independence was not only possible, but inevitable. The pamphlet sold over 100,000 copies in a few months. For a population of just 2.5 million, its impact was explosive. For the first time, independence was not whispered, it was demanded. Independence declared at terrible risk. On July 4, 1776, in Philadelphia, the Continental Congress adopted a document that would make reconciliation impossible. The Declaration of Independence did not merely announce separation, it accused the king of tyranny, it justified rebellion, it invited destruction. Its final lines were a promise and a threat to its own signers. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. They knew what they were doing. If Britain won, they would be hanged. When reality crushed idealism. Within weeks, Britain struck back with overwhelming force. In August 1776, British troops landed in New York with more than 30,000 soldiers, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent overseas. The result was disaster. Washington's army was crushed at the Battle of Long Island. Thousands were killed or captured. Morale collapsed. Officers whispered that the war was already lost. Washington faced annihilation. Then he did something extraordinary. Under cover of fog, at night, he evacuated his entire army across the East River, right under the noses of the British. It was not victory, but it was survival. The darkest hour. By December 1776, the revolution was dying. The Continental Army shrank to a few thousand starving men. Enlistments were about to expire. Desertions increased. The public lost faith. Thomas Paine wrote again, this time for the soldiers. These are the times that try men's souls. Washington knew he had one chance to save the cause. On Christmas night, in freezing darkness, he led his remaining troops across the ice-choked Delaware River. Many had no boots. Some left bloody footprints in the snow. Ice smashed against boats. Men fell into the river and drowned. At Dahlman, they struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was small, but its impact was enormous. For the first time, Americans believed again. War of attrition, war of faith. The years that followed were brutal. Battles were won and lost. Brandywine, Saratoga, Monmouth. Cities fell. Philadelphia was occupied. Families were divided between loyalists and patriots. At Valley Forge, during the winter of 1777 to 78, nearly 2,500 American soldiers died, not from combat, but from cold, hunger, and disease. And yet the army did not dissolve. Why? Because belief had hardened into identity. Men no longer fought only against Britain, they fought for America, even though America did not yet exist. A world takes notice. In 1777, American forces captured a British army at Saratoga. It was a turning point. France, Britain's ancient rival, saw opportunity. In 1778, France formally entered the war on America's side, providing money, weapons, troops, and, most importantly, naval power. The war was no longer colonial, it was global. The war turned south. Britain shifted strategy, believing the southern colonies were full of loyalists. They were wrong. The Southern campaign became savage. Neighbors fought neighbors. Slavery complicated every decision. The war became personal, cruel, and unforgiving. Figures like Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion used guerrilla tactics, exhausting British forces through constant pressure rather than decisive battles. Britain won cities, but lost the countryside. Yorktown, the end that almost didn't happen. In 1781, British General Cornwallis fortified his army at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington saw the moment. In a daring coordination with French forces, American and French armies marched south, while the French Navy blocked British escape by sea. The siege lasted weeks. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. The impossible had happened.
Victory did not bring peace. When the guns finally fell silent after Yorktown, there were no parades for most Americans, only exhaustion, grief, and uncertainty. The war had ended in theory, but in practice, the continent was shattered. Towns lay burned, farms were ruined, families were divided beyond repair. Thousands of soldiers returned home to nothing. Independence had been won, but a nation had not yet been built. A broken beginning. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. Britain withdrew its forces. The empire that had ruled the colonies for over a century stepped back from the continent. What remained was chaos. The new United States had no real government. Under the Articles of Confederation, the central authority was intentionally weak, by design. Americans feared tyranny more than disorder. Congress could not levy taxes. It could not regulate commerce. It could not enforce laws. The states behaved like suspicious neighbors, not partners. Some printed worthless money. Others imposed tariffs on each other. Debts from the war piled higher every year. Independence, it turned out, was easier than unity. The soldiers who were forgotten. Perhaps the greatest betrayal fell upon the very men who had won the war. Continental soldiers were promised pay, often never delivered. Veterans returned to farms seized for debt, families starving, bodies broken. Many were treated not as heroes, but as problems. In 1786, desperation turned into rebellion. In western Massachusetts, a former Continental officer named Daniel Shays led armed farmers against courthouses and tax collectors. They shut down courthouses. They demanded relief. To the elite, it was terrifying. If the government could not protect property, what was the revolution for? George Washington watched in silence, but with growing alarm. He had retired to Mount Vernon, believing his public life was over. But Shays' rebellion revealed a truth he could not ignore. The American experiment was collapsing. A secret convention. In 1783, delegates from 12 states gathered in Philadelphia, not to repair the Articles, but to replace them. The Constitutional Convention was officially a revision meeting. In reality, it was a revolution within the revolution. The doors were locked, windows closed, guards stood watch. Nothing spoken inside was meant for the public, because what they were doing was dangerous. Men with conflicting visions.
The men in that room were not united by idealism. They were divided by fear, ambition, and experience. James Madison believed in a strong central government. Alexander Hamilton distrusted democracy itself. Small states feared domination by large ones. Southern states feared losing slavery. Northern states feared aristocracy. They argued endlessly. How much power should the people have? How should representation be equal or proportional? Should slavery be acknowledged or ignored? Slavery haunted every debate like a ghost no one dared name openly. In the end, compromise triumphed over purity. The Constitution, a fragile balance. The Constitution created a new structure, bold, untested, and fragile. 3 branches of government, checks and balances, federal authority stronger than before, but limited. And slavery? Protected, but unnamed. The word itself never appeared, but enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation, giving slave states more power, not less. It was a moral failure wrapped in political necessity. The delegates knew it. They signed anyway. A promise demanded. When the Constitution was sent to the states, resistance erupted. Where were the protections for individual liberty? What stopped this new government from becoming another tyranny? The answer became the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, press, due process, and more. Even then, ratification was narrow. The United States was born not in celebration, but in argument. The first president. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. He did not want the job. He feared power. He feared precedent. He feared becoming what Americans had just overthrown. But he accepted, because refusal might destroy the nation before it began. Washington's greatest contribution was not policy, it was restraint. He stepped down after 2 terms, establishing a tradition that would last over a century. In doing so, he proved that leadership did not require permanence. A nation divides again. Peace did not end conflict. Almost immediately, Americans split into political factions. Hamilton envisioned a strong federal government, national banks, and industrial power. Jefferson feared centralized authority and championed agrarian independence. They accused each other of betraying the revolution. Newspapers became weapons. Politics turned personal. Compromise became rare. America had survived monarchy. It was now threatened by itself. The original sin grows. While white Americans debated liberty, millions lived in chains. Slavery expanded westward. Cotton made it profitable beyond imagination. Enslaved families were bought, sold, and broken apart to fuel a growing economy. The contradiction was undeniable. A nation founded on freedom depended on bondage. Some saw it. Many ignored it. Most benefited from it.
As the 19th century dawned, the United States stood at a crossroads it refused to acknowledge. On the surface, the nation appeared confident, expanding borders, growing population, increasing wealth. But beneath that confidence lay violence, contradiction, and unresolved guilt. The ideals written in ink were being tested by realities written in blood. America was growing, and growth in this land meant conquest. The first victims of expansion. Long before railroads and settlers, indigenous nations had lived across the continent in complex societies governed by law, diplomacy, and tradition. But to American expansionists, native land was not home, it was opportunity. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a decision that doubled the size of the United States overnight. The Louisiana Purchase acquired vast territory from France. Jefferson celebrated it as a triumph for farmers and liberty. But no one asked the people already living on that land. Expansion now had momentum. Removal by law, death by reality. As settlers pushed west, conflict became inevitable. Indigenous resistance was labeled hostility. Survival was labeled savagery. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, legalizing the forced relocation of native nations east of the Mississippi River. The law spoke of order. Reality delivered horror. Tens of thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole people were driven from their homes. Families walked hundreds of miles under armed guard. Food was scarce, disease rampant. The Trail of Tears killed thousands. The United States expanded. Indigenous America was broken. Slavery tightens its grip. While indigenous nations were destroyed in the name of progress, slavery tightened its grip on the nation's soul. The invention of the cotton gin made slavery more profitable than ever. Plantations spread across the South. Enslaved labor became the backbone of American wealth. Men, women, and children were treated as property. Their resistance, whether escape, rebellion, or quiet endurance, was met with whips, chains, and death. Politicians spoke of compromise. The enslaved lived its cost. A nation divided by geography and morality. As new states formed in the West, the same question returned again and again: free or slave? The Missouri Compromise attempted balance. The Compromise of 1850 delayed disaster. The Kansas-Nebraska Act unleashed violence. Blood was spilled in Kansas before war was ever declared. Americans no longer argued only in words, they fought. Voices that refused silence. Despite the danger, voices rose against slavery. Frederick Douglass escaped bondage and exposed the lie of American liberty with devastating clarity. Harriet Tubman risked her life repeatedly to guide others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Their courage terrified slaveholders, because truth is dangerous to power. The election that broke the Union. In 1860, Americans elected Abraham Lincoln, a man opposed to the expansion of slavery but committed to preserving the Union. The South heard only one thing: the end was coming. One by one, Southern states seceded. They formed the Confederate States of America. They claimed states' rights, but their Constitution protected slavery explicitly. The nation fractured. War comes at dawn. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter. The Civil War began. It would be the deadliest conflict in American history. Brother fought brother. Father fought son. The nation tore itself apart to decide what it truly was. The cost of war. Battles like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh slaughtered men by the thousands. Technology outpaced tactics. Rifles, trenches, and artillery turned fields into graves. Lincoln struggled not only with generals, but with conscience. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people, but it transformed the war. The Union now fought not just to preserve itself, but to end slavery. Freedom paid in blood. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers fought for the Union. Many had escaped slavery. Others were free men defending a future that barely acknowledged them. They fought bravely. They were paid less.
They were treated worse, but they fought anyway. An end and a murder. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. The war was over. Slavery was dead. But peace did not arrive. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. As the nation mourned, a question lingered. What kind of freedom would follow?
The war had ended, but the peace was hollow. In the spring of 1865, the United States stood victorious and shattered. 4 years of civil war had killed more than 600,000 people. Entire regions lay in ruin. Railroads twisted like broken bones. Cities were ash. Farms were graveyards. And 4 million enslaved people stood at the edge of freedom, staring into a future no one had prepared for. Freedom, it turned out, was not a destination. It was a battlefield. Reconstruction, a promise almost kept. After Lincoln's assassination, the task of rebuilding the nation fell to men far less committed to justice. Reconstruction was meant to do 3 things: rebuild the South, integrate formerly enslaved people into civic life, prevent the return of the old plantation elite. For a brief, fragile moment, it worked. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and equality before the law. The 15th Amendment protected black male voting rights. For the first time in American history, black men voted, held office, and shaped law. Schools were built, families reunited, churches became centers of hope. It was revolutionary, and it terrified those who had lost power. Terror as policy. White supremacist groups rose almost immediately. The Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and other militias used lynching, intimidation, and murder to destroy black political participation. Violence was not random, it was strategic. Local law enforcement often participated. Federal troops intervened sometimes, but Northern resolve faded. Americans grew tired of enforcing justice. The Great Betrayal. In 1877, a disputed presidential election ended Reconstruction. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Black Americans were left unprotected. What followed was a century-long system of racial apartheid known as Jim Crow. Voting rights vanished through literacy tests and poll taxes. Segregation was enforced by law. Lynching became public spectacle. Equality existed only on paper. The promise of the Civil War was abandoned. An empire of steel and smoke. While the South fell into racial terror, the North entered an age of furious industrial growth. Factories roared, railroads stretched across the continent, cities exploded with people. Immigrants arrived by the millions, Irish fleeing famine, Italians escaping poverty, Jews fleeing persecution, Chinese workers building railroads under brutal conditions. America grew rich, but it grew unequal. Children worked in factories, workers labored 12-hour days, industrial accidents crushed bodies daily. Wealth concentrated in the hands of a few men whose names became synonymous with power: Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan. This was the Gilded Age, gold on the surface, rot underneath. Labor bleeds for rights. Workers organized. They struck. They were beaten, arrested, and killed. Events like the Haymarket Affair, the Pullman Strike, and the Homestead Strike revealed a government more willing to protect corporations than citizens. But resistance planted seeds. Unions survived. Reform crept forward. America looks outward. By the end of the 19th century, the United States no longer saw itself as a fragile republic. It saw itself as a power.
In 1898, the Spanish-American War announced America's arrival on the global stage. The U.S. took control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Freedom was preached, empire was practiced. Progressivism and pressure. The early 20th century brought reformers, journalists, activists, politicians who exposed corruption and demanded change. Women fought for the vote. Journalists exposed corporate crimes. The government began regulating food, drugs, and monopolies. Progress was real, but it was uneven. A world at war. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. Young men crossed oceans to fight a war they barely understood. The nation mobilized industry, propaganda, and fear. When the war ended, America emerged stronger but unsettled. The world had changed. So had America.